everybody. Recording live from somewhere. This is Zach Couples with episode number 104 of the Movement Debrief. And tonight, folks, you know my steez, we're going to talk about Kegels. Did you see it? I hope not. We're going to talk about Kegels, both front side and back side. Is this a useful tactic to improve movement options and pelvic floor stuff? Stay tuned. We're going to talk about overhead reaching. When is it cool to raise the roof? When you're talking about getting yourself moving better, feeling better, all types of good stuff. I'll give you the answer. And last but not least, we're going to talk about overuse versus deconditioned. When is it that you just got to do a little bit more of that stuff to feel good, or hey, you did a little bit of too much too soon and you need to back off? These are the questions that I'm going to ask tonight, or answer tonight, and they have been asked by the people. They'll be answered for the people by this people right here, fam recognized fam. Without further ado, let's debrief, shall we? The first question is brought to you by Topo Chico, but it is asked by Dana. Lead Mem T Fam Bro Dana. Here's what Dana has to say. Can you relate pelvic diaphragm mechanics to the cue, pretend like you are holding in gas, and when to use that cue? If you cue hold in gas on the inhale, does it activate the pelvic floor? Shouldn't you want pelvic floor to activate on the exhale, moving up like a piston within the thoracic diaphragm? Dana, this is an awesome question. So let's look at what the pelvic floor and the mechanics of the pelvis, what that is when we're talking about breathing. So the pelvis normally sits in some degree of anterior tilt, which is nutation of the sacrum. That's the sacrum tipping forward. And as that happens, the innominates, your big bones on the sides of the hips, ought to rotate posteriorly. When you take a breath of air in, those actions should reverse. So there's going to be some degree of counternutation, or the sacrum tipping backwards, and the innominates are going to rotate anteriorly. This is going to spread the top of the pelvis apart so it can catch the viscera, which is descending downward. If we look at the pelvic floor in this case, I have a situation where the bottom of the pelvic floor, the sacrum and the coccyx, is moving more anteriorly. Muscles that attach here would be, if we're talking pelvic floor, would be your external anal sphincter. So if you're having some degree of counternutation, that should contract, which to a degree would ascend that portion of the pelvic floor. On the anterior aspect of the pelvic floor, if we were to cut this in half, these muscles are what should actually descend or eccentrically orient to some degree. And the reason why that is because it allows all of the viscera, including the goods, to push downward as you take a breath of air in, fill the lungs with air. That's inhalation. When I exhale, that relationship flip-flops. If the sacrum is going to nutate and the top of the pelvis, the inlet, gets squished via posterior rotation of the SI joint, then I have a reverse of that relationship. The coccyx and the bottom of the sacrum are moving more posteriorly, which is going to a degree eccentrically orient the posterior pelvic floor, such as your external anal sphincter, and the anterior aspect of the pelvis should concentrically orient, thus assisting with the viscera moving upward and air exiting the thorax. To summarize that, big keys is posterior pelvic floor more active with inhalation concentrically. Anterior pelvic floor is more concentrically active during exhalation. You have this alternating descension and ascension between these two aspects of the pelvic floor. So let's talk about the cue, pretending like you are holding in gas, or as I like to tell my clientele, the taco squeeze. With the taco squeeze, or holding in gas, in theory, If you are isolating it to the external anal sphincter muscle, that should counternutate the sacrum. If the sacrum counternutates, then I'm going to get anterior SI joint rotation. The inlet of the pelvis is going to spread more apart, and we're going to be emphasizing more inhalation mechanics. So this could be a useful strategy for someone who needs inhalation-based mechanics, which is just about everyone, because most of us are using some degree of an exhalation-based strategy. Most of us have more anterior pelvic orientation or tilt than is desirable, and that can limit movement options. So this could be a useful cue for some people. On the flip side, in theory, if I were to cue holding in your pee, that could be a useful cue for someone who needs more exhalation-based strategies, or they need assistance with exhalation. So you could ideally differentiate these two things. Now this is where the problems come in. Most individuals have a very challenging time differentiating the posterior pelvic floor from the anterior pelvic floor. If you cue these individuals to hold in gas or hold in your pee, they just contract everything and hope for the best. That's one layer of it. The individuals who are really struggling, and maybe they're using more compensatory strategies that needed to reduce movement options, when you cue these people to hold in gas, they may actually just clench their butt cheeks. When that happens, which by the way, is butt cheeks spelled as one word, or do I just spread them apart? Anyways, so as I counternutate the sacrum, or if I externally rotate, or if I contract the glute max, that's going to externally rotate the femurs. When the femurs externally rotate, you're going to get more compressive forces on the posterior aspect of the pelvis, which is going to squish this from this side. So you're almost compressing things A to P in the pelvis. And that's not desirable, because when you do that, that's going to negatively impact the normal respiratory mechanics of the pelvis. So we have to assume two things for this cue to work. One, can the individuals you're working with differentiate posterior pelvic floor from anterior pelvic floor? And overarching that, can they do a contraction such as the taco squeeze without overly clenching the glutes? This is really tough for a lot of people. So it's a cue that I've been moving away from, but I'm not moving away from that cue for those reasons. When I use the cue, the taco squeeze or the glute contraction, generally when I did that, it was after I coached the posterior tilt or the tucking effectively, and the individual who I was working with had the breathing mechanics that I was utilizing to improve movement options down pat. From that point, the taco squeeze or cueing holding in gas was just icing on the movement options cake. And more often than not, when I use that cue in that order, I would get some substantial changes in the sensory feedback that clients would give me. A lot of them would feel a significantly greater amount of posterior thorax expansion, and the tests reflect that. So I don't think you can fairly say that these cues are not good or they're not useful. It really depends on the person that you're working with. And I think if you can coach in that sequence, they could potentially be a useful cue. The only downside about cueing pelvic floor contractions is you don't necessarily know what strategy they're doing, unless you are a pelvic floor therapist and you have palpation capabilities. But then again, if you're doing activities to improve movement options, chances are you're probably not doing some of the basic biofeedback stuff that some pelvic floor therapists may utilize. So it's really tough to say. You ideally would use cues like they would get improvements in posterior expansion, or you use your tests to let you know that you are doing the right things and you're getting an effective outcome with that type of cue. Now, why is it that I moved away from that cue? And from my aspect, even though I thought it was a useful cue for improving movement capabilities, there's a lot going on with a lot of these exercises that we might coach someone through to improve their movement options, at least on the lower level. So to add another thing to worry about was not useful for my people. Most of them have a hard enough time with creating the tuck and getting the breathing sequence down pat that I would coach. So to have that piece and then also maintain this position and to add a pelvic floor contraction, it was just too much. And I found over time that I inevitably was just dropping that off and not using it, and I was still getting similar benefits. I think if you make sure that the stack of the thorax and the pelvis is done well, and you put people into positions that force the body to move in directions that it's not normally accustomed to, then you're probably going to get a good enough outcome without cueing pelvic floor contractions. All that being said, it can be a useful tool for some people. You just have to be mindful that you're not over coaching and over cueing individuals as they're doing stuff. So to summarize your question, Dana, because it was a very good one, holding in gas assists with sacral counternutation, which is normal inhalation mechanics. That's different from holding in your pee, which would be the anterior portion of your pelvic floor. A cue like that could be useful for some individuals, assuming that you have the posterior pelvic tilt and the breathing capabilities that we've discussed ad nauseum on this podcast and many others. So you want to make sure you have that first and foremost. If you don't have that, then you may actually get compensatory activity to try to do that. They might be contracting the pelvic floor as a whole as opposed to that differentiation, or they might be using superficial musculature like the glute max to try to create that contraction, which is not necessarily desirable. That could potentially reinforce the movement restrictions that you see. So your best bet is to make sure you can coach the stack, put people into exercises that get the movement outcomes you want. And if you do those things, you ought to be in business. Great question, Dana. Now, I'm sure a lot of you are wondering, well, Zach, what's up with this stack? Well, I'll tell you, the stack is incredibly important because it is a position that allows you to maximize intra-abdominal and intrathoracic pressure, and it can improve your client's abilities to move in multiple directions. Because a lot of times when people lose that ability to stack the thoracic and pelvic diaphragms, movement limitations can occur, and then you might be limited in your exercise repertoire selection, or it could be a contributing factor to pain. Now the question is then, well, Zach, how do I coach this with my clients? And that's, if I'm a clinician or a trainer. Well, the answer is at Human Matrix, folks. It is coming your way because we talk about that. We talk about how to apply that concept both at a rehabilitation level, at a low-level side of things, and at the highest level of performance. And we've had another great turnout this upcoming weekend in New York City. There's a lot of people going to this one. It's still got some on sale, but it's been a really good year. We've had a lot of good people coming to these seminars, and I hope to see you at some of them. The list of when seminars are this weekend, November 23rd and 24th in Queens, New York City. Tickets are still available, so if you want to come, I'd love to see you there. Next year, January 25th and 26th in Scotts Valley, California, the Bay Area. April 4th and 5th in Atlanta, Georgia, where the players play. May 23rd and 24th in Dickinson College, that's in Carlisle, Pennsylvania. June 6th and 7th, Minneapolis, Minnesota. August 1st and 2nd, Boston, Massachusetts. September 12th and 13th in Montreal, Canada. And October 3rd and 4th in Ann Arbor, Michigan. Another seminar that I am doing, folks, is with myself, Pat Davidson, and Seth Oberst. It's called The Uprising. That's also in Boston, Massachusetts on February 8th and 9th. At this seminar, we are going to be dispelling a lot of the conventional thoughts and tactics that are utilized in the health and performance realm. I personally am going to be differentiating squatting and hinging, and folks, a lot of you are just hinging twice. So if you want to learn more, you might want to come to The Uprising. The next question comes from the legend, a dear friend of mine, Gerard, a.k.a. G-Easy. Here's what he asks me. Does an incline or overhead positioning encourage pump handle activity? If I have a wide ISA, or infrasternal angle, with an inhaled pump handle, wouldn't I want to avoid much of that? I hate to say this, Gerard, but I have failed you as a teacher and a mentor. With wide infrasternal angle, they do not necessarily have an up pump handle. we have to look at the structure of these individuals. So a wide infrasternal angle, that is a compensatory measure that happens to an exhaled axial skeleton. What an exhaled axial skeleton is when basically all of the spinal segments move more anteriorly. So what you would have is increased sacral nutation, you'd have an increased lumbar lordosis, you'd have a flat thoracic spine, and you'd have a military head posture. That would be an exhaled axial skeleton because that's the position that your body goes into relatively when you're letting air out. That orientation allows air to evacuate the body. Now, if you can't go the other way, reversing all that, inhalation, you still got to get air in somehow. The solution could be to do so at the lower rib cage, widen the infrasternal angle. So I drop that down to allow myself to get air in, even though I can't get expansion in other areas. In theory, for this individual, a wide infrasternal angle at a baseline compensatory measure, the upper thoracic spine should be exhaled or flat, but also the pump handle should be flat. So what they have is a reduction of the anterior to posterior dimensions in the thorax. So these individuals might not be able to get air in well. But if I keep going down the compensatory lamb, if I keep going down compensatory city, and I go into a more exhaled orientation, the scaps get pulled more posteriorly and into external rotation. What that might do is it might allow me to get some degree of pseudo pump handle by filling more of the bottom aspects of the lungs up. And these individuals actually might present with full shoulder internal rotation. But they're lying to you. They still might need pump handle activity because at a baseline measure, their anterior to posterior dimensions, or from a structural standpoint, their anterior to posterior dimensions are still squished. All they did was they tipped the thorax backwards to give the appearance of a pump handle. So, what do you need to do? You might actually want to encourage activities that allow some degree of pump handle. But why is overhead or incline positioning useful? This has to deal with what's going on in the thorax as I reach overhead. And when I'm talking overhead, I'm talking 120 degrees of shoulder flexion and above. There's a great study that I read recently by Paula Ludwig. I'll link it in the show notes, which will be found on zachcouples.com. That this was such a badass study, and the reason why, well, you know, it was badass was the subjects. So these subjects, I think there was 13 of them. Don't quote me on that. They got pins surgically put into their humerus, their clavicle, and their scapula, and they measured what was going on at those regions as the individuals flexed the shoulder, and shoulder flexion, scaption, and shoulder abduction. And the general trend is you have an increase in external rotation of the humerus and the scapula as you go up to 120 to 180. In shoulder flexion in particular, the humerus has maximal shoulder external rotation, which I think they measured at between 50 and 60 degrees. If I have maximal shoulder external rotation, then muscles that internally rotate the shoulder are going to be eccentrically oriented. That would include the pec major, which is going to allow for the pump handle activity to occur. That would also include the lats, which may allow for some degree of posterior expansion. Now, we talked about the front dimension, so we are getting some pump handle, but if I have someone who's squished front to back, will I get some degree of posterior expansion as well as I progress further overhead? And the answer is yes. Here's why. Even though the scapula is externally rotating as I go overhead, secondary to the upward rotation action, two things. I'm having a significant amount of scapular upward rotation. That's going to increase concentric orientation in your middle and lower trap and serratus anterior. Simultaneously, though, it's also going to eccentrically orient the rhomboids, which are a downward rotator. The rhomboids run from T1 to T5. So if those muscles are eccentrically oriented, in theory, you actually should be able to get some air posteriorly between those areas. Also, in the finished position, when I start to go overhead, the scapula is oriented more in the scapular plane. The scapular plane is between 40 and 45 degrees of abduction. Basically, it's going to be more on the side of your rib cage. Now I have a situation where I'm not having a bone block air going posteriorly. So that position, in theory, going overhead ought to allow for A to P expansion secondary to humeral and scapular position, which is perfect for someone who's a wide infrasternal angle, because that's exactly what they need. And that's why this can be a very useful tactic for someone who is wide. It could also be a useful position for someone who's a narrow infrasternal angle who's also compressed anterior to posterior as a secondary compensatory strategy. That's why overhead and incline positions can be useful for these people. All of that being said, that is assuming that you can keep the stack that we talked about before, because that will then allow the thorax, they'll provide the base to allow the thorax to expand in all directions. And that's why, Gerard, you still need to reach overhead. You still need to do incline pressing with your wide infrasternal angle people. To summarize, a wide infrasternal angle is squished front to back, A to P. You must do things to allow expansion, A to P. The overhead position, 120 and above, is a nice middle ground that allows for anterior expansion, i.e. the pump handle mechanism, to occur because the shoulder is externally rotated at flexion, which would stretch the pec. Also because the rhomboids are more eccentric, and because the scapula is aligned in the scapular plane in those angles, it should allow for some degree of posterior expansion, especially in the upper thorax. Gerard, unbelievable question. The last question of the evening comes from Lucy. Here's what Lucy has to say. And yes, she actually did say this. Hey, Zach, how are you? My dude, the legend, Big Z. Quote, when is it overuse, someone did too much and needs recovery, and when do you encourage a person to do more? They are deconditioned, i.e. they're sore because they haven't worked these areas in a while. Lucy, this is a great question. The biggest keys for me, if we're talking overuse, then we're probably talking some degree of injury, or they're going down the pain route in an undesirable manner. So what you can look at is what are the cardinal signs and symptoms of inflammation. Because if I sustain an injury, I'm probably going to have some inflammation crack-a-lackin'. There's 4 of them. Actually, there's 5 of them. What am I talking about? So redness, right? Is it red in the area that it hurts? Is it hot? Is there swelling? And is there pain? Those are really like the big 4. Why do I think I'm missing one? Heat, redness, swelling, pain. Oh, loss of function. Yeah. So, and they can't do what they normally did. So if you have those things, and there's a great picture of it, I'll link it in the show notes. If it's hot, if it's red, if it's swollen, if it's painful, and you have a loss of function, you can't do what you were doing before, you probably have some type of injury. You need to lay low, like Snoop Dogg with Master P. That would be one scenario. Another scenario to consider when there might be an overuse or an injury or pain secondary to overuse and they need rest. I also like using symptom location to differentiate that. If you have someone who's deconditioned and they get sore, generally with that, it's more diffuse, it's more like the whole muscle area, it's kind of vague. You know, oh, my quads are sore. They're rubbing their quads in all directions. Or it's like, oh man, my pecs, they en fuego after I did that bench press. Things like that. And if it's a more diffuse general soreness and they don't have these signs, then it's probably a deconditioned thing, and they might actually benefit from doing the exercises again, because a lot of times doing the exercises again, maybe at a lower volume, can actually improve some of the muscle soreness that they might be expecting. Now, if they have a situation where it's a focal part, my biceps tendon hurts, or my patellar tendon hurts, especially tendons. If it's joint line tenderness, if it's an area that's not diffuse and they can pinpoint it, then you probably are dealing with something that's more overuse and you want to chill. You got to chill. That's especially true for tendons, because a lot of times tendons can get sore and it will be general and kind of diffuse within the tendon region. But tendons respond to loading but also recovering. And if you load too much too soon, you can develop tendon issues, and that will be undesirable. So you want to make sure that that's not something you necessarily push through, whereas muscle soreness, you're probably okay. There's actually a study I read a while back that showed that delayed onset muscle soreness actually has a lot to do with changes at the nerves in the spinal cord. So it may just be like a protective central sensitization that occurs. And if I can find that study, I will most certainly link it in the show notes, central sensitization. So those are the big things. Now, sometimes you'll have people who squat a bunch and their knee hurts, and it might be general and diffuse. If it's in the joint region, you may not necessarily want to push through that. What I would consider with those people is letting them know, it's okay, you probably do just have some soreness in that area. It's not a big deal. We might just modify your activity levels for the day to make you feel better, but you can still keep going and pushing through that. And those are really the big ways for me to differentiate overuse versus someone who's deconditioned. So to summarize your wonderful question, Lucy, overuse, be mindful of the cardinal signs of inflammation, which are heat, redness, swelling, pain, and loss of function. If you have any of that, you probably want to chill. Also, if it's in areas like tendons or joint lines, and it's not muscle, and it's not that diffuse thing you feel with delayed onset muscle soreness, or they can pinpoint it, it hurts right here, and then it might not be something you want to necessarily push through. If you have someone who does have delayed onset muscle soreness, it actually might be worthwhile to have them push through that, albeit with lesser volume so they don't hit you, because it may just be some changes that have happened at the spinal cord that have contributed to that delayed onset muscle soreness. And a lot of times movement is a good way to help clear out some of the metabolic byproducts that could be a contributing factor to that soreness. Lucy, you're an amazing person. Thank you for asking that question. I think that's a good stopping point for us tonight. I want to thank all of you beautiful, sexy, outstanding people for tuning in. If you want to learn more, came in late, will you put those overuse symptoms in the show notes? Yes, Jim Brown 103, I will put the picture in there. It's a really good picture. So I don't think I can do that because of copyright, dang it, but I will put a link to the picture. So thank you so much for tuning in. If you want to learn more, go to zachcouples.com. There you can subscribe to my newsletter. You definitely want to do that because I have so many good free things to give you. We have a course available called Human Matrix Foundations. It is essential if you're going to come to my seminar. What we do in that course is we go through a lot of basic breathing mechanics and movement mechanics and help prep you for all the wild and crazy things that I'll be talking about on my website. I also have about 5 hours of talks. Many of them are on breathing. I got a really good one on pain that I think would be worthwhile for you to listen to. We also have a free acute to chronic workload calculator so you can progress someone in a manner that respects not falling into these overuse injuries. The other thing I have is weekend goodies every Friday. If you want the best of what's going on the internets and research and with books, your boy Big Z has got your back. Once you've done that, I most certainly... There is no Miami, Once you've scoured zachcouples.com in that regard, I also offer 3 services. The first one is movement consultation. So maybe you're not moving as well as you like to, or you have movement restrictions that are impacting your your fitness levels in the gym, or you can't do as much as you'd like to, or maybe it's your clients as well. Well, we can go through a movement consultation where I will perform an assessment and evaluation on you. We'll find out what areas you're limited in, and then we'll give you activities that are tailored to your needs to improve those movement options. And I do this within session. We keep operating until we get a favorable change in your movement capabilities, and I've had quite a few people feel pretty awesome after these. Definitely want to check that out. Or if you want to go to the next level, we can take that movement consultation and apply it in the fitness realm, because we can also design a fitness program that takes those movement limitations and also takes your fitness goals, puts them together, and allows you to get your fitness gains the way you want them. And that's where my online training program comes in, where we do free consultations. I give you 6 weeks of programming so you can really learn the movement concepts that I teach, but also do it while maintaining and gaining your fitness goals. If you want to learn how to do this stuff with your people, because you're like, well, does this apply to my population? Short answer, probably. Well, we can sift through that. That's where the mentorship program comes in. I've worked with a bunch of different people, whether it's implementing these concepts with their clientele, learning some of the meat and potatoes behind this stuff from an anatomy biomechanics standpoint, as well as application, or if it's just getting yourself organized, because that's another thing that I really have worked hard on over the years. You know, I'm working several hours in the clinic right now, doing this online stuff, making sure my girlfriend doesn't hate me. How do you do all that? I can help you streamline these processes. That's where the mentorship program comes in. Please sign up there. Once you've scoured ZachCouples.com, you'll also want to check me out on iTunes and Stitcher, The Zach Couples Show. Because guess what, folks? There's 103 other debriefs. And, you know, the video quality wasn't good on some of the earlier ones, so maybe you want to just, give me a listen. I've definitely checked that out. Also, while you're there, please leave a review so the fam can keep growing. Social media-wise, I am on Facebook /ZCouples. The Twitter handle is @ZCouples. I'm on that Instagram, baby, of course, Zach, ZAC Couples, CUPPLES. And last but not least, I'm also on YouTube. If you search Zach Couples, if you want to join I think I got almost 2,000 subscribers on getting the most up-to-date stuff on exercises that I'm using, the movement debrief, high definition style is on there, all types of stuff, case studies. You definitely want to go ahead and check that out. Thank you so much. Again, you've been a wonderful audience. I appreciate each and every one of you. I want you to keep it real, but not to the extent where things go wrong. Stay hungry, stay learning, and stay moving. And I'll see you next time. Deuces.